Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's installment of our ongoing Capital Kids series. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the great pleasure of working as Director of Operations and Scholarship for the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. We're so glad that so many of you are taking time out of your day to join us, especially if you're joining us from a classroom in the D.C. area or around the country. Before we get started with today's fantastic program and our wonderful author, I'd like to do a little bit of technical housekeeping. One of the ways we like to use this Zoom webinar platform to engage with you live, nationwide, coast to coast, is through the question and answer session at the end of each talk. And so if you have any questions for Ms. Coles throughout today's program about her fantastic book and her research, you can put those questions into the Q&A section of the webinar. That looks like two speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what sort of device you're using to join us today. Now, if you have any technical difficulties or if you think you need any technical troubleshooting, I'd like you to put those sorts of matters into the chat function, which I'll be keeping an eye on in real time. But again, any content questions, any questions about the book we're talking about today, or any questions for Ms. Coles can go into that Q&A section of the webinar. It's now also my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, who's going to start today's program by introducing our speaker. Jane?
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, as always, for all the work that you do behind the scenes to bring these to light, and to Donna Sparkley, our education specialist, who found the story, found the author, and here we are with Michelle Coles. We're so delighted that you are here with us. It is an amazing phenomenon. We were talking for a minute beforehand, and Michelle Coles is a debut novelist, an experienced civil rights attorney, and now a mother of 5 sons as of a week ago. And so she is here with us, brand new mom. And she's a 9th generation Louisianan who is highly attuned to the struggles that African Americans have faced in overcoming the legacy of slavery and the periods of government sanctioned discrimination that followed. Her goal in writing for young people is to empower them by educating them about their history and giving them tools to shape their own destiny. So in some ways, as we read this book, think about this is written by a mom of 5 sons. The book, Black Was the Ink, celebrates forgotten heroes and better futures in the most imaginative way. Malcolm Williams was a Black teenager living in DC with his mom. His father is absent from life due to a violent tragedy during Malcolm's infancy. When Malcolm himself had a terrifying run-in with the police as a young teenager, his mother decides to send him to his dad's family farm in Mississippi. This is the last place on earth that Malcolm wants to go. And initially, Malcolm isn't bothered when he learns that the farm is in danger of being acquired by the state to expand the highway. But soon, otherworldly powers change his opinion by taking him back in time to 1866 and stuffing him into the body of Cedric Johnson, one of his ancestors. While walking in Cedric's shoes, Malcolm meets several Black heroes who fought for change during the Reconstruction Era, mostly people that a lot of us hadn't heard about. The experience is both astounding and crushing. After all, if the heroes Malcolm meets didn't achieve lasting change, can he make a difference? In the end, Malcolm learns how to fight for his convictions and employ the lessons he learned from the past to save his family's legacy and future. Michelle Coles sensitively explores what it means to care about something, to fight for something, and to impact lasting change. Teenagers can immediately connect with Malcolm's journey and readily identify the real-life issues involving systematic oppression, social justice, and racism that is so well examined. And it is our pleasure Michelle Coles, tell us about your journey to write this book.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, and thank you for inviting me to join with the U.S. Capitol Historical Society today. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm going to do a share screen, if that's okay, to start my presentation, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself and also about my book. So my book is Black Was the Ink, and as Ms. Campbell described, it is about a young African-American teenager who goes from Washington, D.C. to stay on his family's farm in Natchez, Mississippi, where he learns that his family's farm is in jeopardy of being taken by the state to expand a highway. The same farm had actually, portions of the farm had been taken 50 years prior when the highway was initially built. And the state is interested in expanding the highway. And so they want to use the state powers like eminent domain to take more of his family's land. And that portion of the story is actually based on something that happened in my family's experience in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, where my grandmother's neighborhood, she lived in an African-American and Creole neighborhood in Baton Rouge, where they had their own school and their own church and a very vibrant community. And in the 1950s, the entire community was destroyed to build the US highway system that went through their neighborhood. And that's actually a very common experience in lots of different cities throughout the country, where the highway system was routed and directed and went through African-American communities in a very disruptive way. But part of what that is a reflection of, I think, in the decision for why African-American communities were often where these disruptions were routed, is because the African-Americans in those communities lacked political power and they lacked political representation, and they didn't have the ability to vote in numbers that were proportionate to their representation in the city. They did not have elected representatives in the federal government or in the state or local government that they could call on and that were accountable and responsive to them. And so the story of Black Was the Ink really gets to the question of why. Why was that the case? Why did Black people not have a government that was accountable to them? And as a result, how has that impacted generations of African Americans? And so Black Was the Ink tells the story of the Reconstruction Era, which was a time in America's history for the very first time that Black people did have these citizenship rights. And the Reconstruction Era was a period in America's history that immediately followed the Civil War, and it preceded the Jim Crow era. It didn't last very long. Most scholars would put it at around a 10-year period, but if the Civil War ended in 1965, and a lot of changes came to our country in the periods immediately following the Civil War. And this Reconstruction era saw the ushering in of different constitutional amendments, of different statutes, and just a transformation in America, where we took a lot of the principles that America had at our country's founding, and they made them more broadly applicable to the larger American population, which included African Americans for the first time. And so that's why I found the period so fascinating and so interesting, and also troubling, because while we did as a country change for this period of time, the change was not lasting. And we saw a lot of those, the implementation of those policies and those laws not being followed through on, which resulted in the Jim Crow era that I think most people are familiar with, when Black people were systematically denied so many of their fundamental constitutional rights. So Black Was the Ink is an exploration of that, looking at the past and the present and how they all relate to one another. It was illustrated by a young man named Cedric Johnson, who is a public art teacher in the District of Columbia, and he's an incredible artist. It was published by Lee and Low Books, which is the largest multicultural children's book publisher in the US, and it was published in November of 2021. I always like to ask people to look at the cover and tell me what they see. And so I welcome you and invite you to make any comments or answer any questions that I have in the chat box. My presentations, I love for them to be interactive. And so I love for people who are watching them to be actively thinking and engaging in the content. And so, so please do contribute to the discussion through answering or putting questions or comments in the chat. So when you look at the cover, what do you see? And so some things that I like to point out that a lot of people notice is they see a book on the floor or on the ground behind the main character. And this is Malcolm pictured on the cover. They see a book and they see pages flying up in the air, right? And what that book is it's Malcolm's ancestor's diary. And so that is actually how Malcolm first learns about the Reconstruction Era and gets pulled into what was happening in the Reconstruction Era. It was through discovering his ancestor Cedric's diary. And so what you see are the pages of the diary floating up into the air and actually forming a thought cloud above Malcolm's head. And so what that is intending to signify is how much learning about this period that he really knew very little, if anything, about before discovering the diary, how much it actually impacted his thoughts, his way of thinking, his understanding of his own ability to create change as his ancestor did before. And what you also see behind all of that is the United States Capitol. And I think Malcolm is looking at the Capitol with a little bit of skepticism because he's very familiar with the story of how America presents itself in terms of being the land of the free and all of the wonderful lofty principles that we all know so well and embrace. But I think he has some questions about where he fits into those promises and those principles and where his ancestors have as well. And so those are some of the things that jump out to me about the cover. Another interesting feature, if you notice the color pattern, is red, white, and blue. So you see Malcolm with a red hoodie on, and I think that outfit is very, characteristic for young, teens. Everyone wears hoodies today, but in particular, I think it's often associated with urban teens. His hairstyle is very modern for young Black men today. But he's got this red hoodie on, and then he's got the blue in the background and the white. And so we really got a red, white, and blue color scheme that is intended to emphasize how pivotal Malcolm's experience and Malcolm's ancestors' experiences are in the formulation of America and so many wonderful things that we love about our country, but the important role that African Americans have played in bringing those principles, those American principles, to fruition. So the inspiration for Black Was the Ink was actually the Mother Emanuel Massacre, which took place on June 17th in 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina. At the time of the massacre, I was a civil rights attorney at the US Department of Justice, and I was actually on maternity leave with my second of 5 sons. And the year was 2015. I think a lot of people at the time had believed that America was potentially entering a new era of race relations. The first African-American president had, been reelected for a second term. And a lot of people described America as being in a post-racial society. And when the Mother Emanuel Massacre occurred, And just to remind people, because I know if there are, classrooms that are tuned in, I understand when I do classroom presentations now that a lot of young people aren't aware of this incident and don't recall it. They were too young when it happened, which is completely understandable. But just to describe what did happen, a young teenage self-described white supremacist went and entered into a historic African-American church in Charleston, North Carolina. South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina. And he went into this church and he sat down and joined an ongoing Bible study. And then about an hour into the Bible study, he stood up with a semi-automatic weapon and just began indiscriminately killing people in, another mass shooting incident. But there was particular things about this mass shooting incident that really struck a chord with me. And for starters, I personally, in my lifetime, had never seen that level of racial violence directed at African Americans. I had never seen anything like that. I had read about things like that, more so things that happened maybe in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, where you had the 16th Street Baptist church bombing in Birmingham, and you had, the assassination of various civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And so I was aware of this level of racial violence could exist, but I believe that as a country we had really moved past that, or so I thought. And when this incident happened, it made me question if it was inevitable that America would continue to progress into a post-racial society that I think many of us do want to see, or if in fact there may be cycles where as we make some progress, there's always going to be some backlash. And so as I was looking at my infant son that I just had, I wanted to find a way to try to explain that potential to him, that, the way that the world is today, there's no guarantees that we will continue to always get better. But he should also be aware that, horrible incidents like the Mother Emanuel massacre may continue to occur. And so I wanted him to have a historical context for understanding horrible things like this. But there was another thing about the church that really inspired the particular story that I wrote. And I looked into the history of the church, which I didn't know anything about. And I learned that it was actually founded by a man named Denmark Vesey, who founded the church in around 1817 or so, the early 1800s. And Denmark Vesey was the leader of one of the largest slave revolts or attempted slave revolts in American history. And he was caught, and the revolt was thwarted, and he was executed along with all of the other people that he was planning this slave revolt with, and they were all executed and hung. And subsequently, South Carolina and Charleston, they passed an ordinance that forbade Black people from practicing their religion, because they realized that a lot of the enslaved people in particular, or even the free Black people, were using their churches as a place to organize against their enslavement and their oppression. And so the Black people were no longer allowed to continue to, attend their churches and practice their faith. But the parishioners of this church continued to meet in secret all the way until the end of the Civil War. And after the Civil War, they built their first brick and mortar church. And the architect for the church, for the Mother Emanuel Church, was actually Denmark Vesey's son, Robert Vesey. And so they built this church, and it's not actually the same building where the massacre took place in 2015, because the church that they built in the Reconstruction Era in the 1870s burned down. But it's still the same church, even though it's not the same church building, if that makes sense. Another fact that I learned that was just fascinating to me was that the head pastor over the Mother Emanuel Church in the Reconstruction Era in the 1870s was a man named Denmark Vesey. I'm sorry, that was a man named Richard Daddy Kane. Apologies for the mix-up. His name was Richard Daddy Kane. And not only was he the pastor of the Mother Emanuel Church, but he was also one of the first Black members of Congress. And I thought that was so interesting, because I think somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that there had been Black members of Congress in the Reconstruction era, but it wasn't a detail that I knew well. I didn't know any of their names. And I just started thinking about how incredible these people must have been to only be a couple of years removed from slavery. And many of these first Black members of Congress had in fact been enslaved people themselves. And a few years later, after the Civil War, they found themselves as members of the United States Congress with the authority to represent their constituents, to advocate for their constituents, to to introduce bills that could help make the lives of the people they were sent to Congress to represent better. And to me, that was just the true embodiment and fulfillment of the American dream. And a perfect example of our country living up to its founding words that all men are created equal, and are entitled to, the right of self-governance. And so that was something else, because of the church, because of this massacre, and me learning about the history of the church. I felt like I was able to see the threads of history going from Denmark Vesey with, Black people organizing against slavery and oppression and trying to revolt against that inhumane treatment, through the Reconstruction era, where again, you see Black people rising up and joining Congress and being a part of the best of American traditions of representing their communities. And then all the way to the present, where again, you're still seeing these echoes of racial division that are rearing their heads in a number of different ways, including in this Mother Emanuel massacre. And so I wanted Malcolm, my character, to be able to take that journey as well and see how the past connects to the present, but also to draw inspiration from the people in the past that really believed they could make a difference. And I wanted him to believe he could make a difference too. So this is a slide where I invite people to write in the chat. And Ms. Campbell, if you see any great answers, or if anyone's participating and you want to bring in their responses, please, feel free to jump in. But what this slide is about is I like to ask people to think about all the things that really make America great and unique as a country in the world from its founding to today. And so I've included on this slide some of the things that really make me proud to be an American, happy to be an American, why I choose to be an American, because, living here is a choice. We could, always choose to move somewhere else. But indisputably, there's some really wonderful things about our country. And so I'm just going to start with some of the things that I think of. And as a caveat, I am a civil rights attorney. And so many of the things that come to mind for me are often legal related, but there are no right or wrong answers here. There's any number of reasons why anyone could be proud or happy to be an American. So for one, we have consent of the governed, which is so important and so empowering for citizens, that we elect our government. We elect people to represent us and to represent our interests. We don't have kings or queens here. We're not subjects of any person or any state. We're really the people in the driver's seat, and our elected representatives are accountable to us. And if we are dissatisfied with their performance, then we don't have to send them back again. And so I think that's a really a wonderful thing that you can't take for granted, because in many parts of the world, that's not the case. We have due process of law here. And so what that means is that the law enforcement should not be able to pick you up off the street and throw you in a jail cell where you can never be heard from again. You are entitled to know the charges that that are against you. If you know if the police, if someone says you've broken the law, you're entitled to know, well, what laws did I break? You are entitled to an attorney, especially for criminal cases. You're entitled to confront your accusers. You're entitled to see the evidence that's against you and to be able to challenge that evidence. The state is the one that holds the burden of proving your guilt. And so all of these things just really help support the concepts of freedom that are so deeply embedded in our American way of life. We have freedom of religion, and that's the freedom to believe any religion you want or to not believe a religion if you don't want to. And in many countries around the world, that's not the case. We have freedom of speech. And so, we can say how we feel and express how we feel in so many different ways. There's equal justice under the law. And so what that means is that all Americans are supposed to be treated equally. You're not supposed to have different applications of the law based on your wealth or based on your race or gender or anything else. We all are supposed to be treated fairly under the law. There's not supposed to be any taxation with representation. And I always have to say that with a caveat or an asterisk for the U.S. territories or places like the District of Columbia, where I know that's the tagline on their license plates. But in general, the fact that we pay taxes, that entitles us to representation in our government. Another idea is similar to equal justice under the law. No man is above the law. So, no person, no president or congressperson or senator or whomever, banker is supposed to not have the law applied to them. We have the right to protest our government, which is so important. If you guys have turned on the international news at any point in history, you can definitely see examples of governments cracking down on people and killing people for engaging in protests. And that's not something that's supposed to happen here. We live in a diverse country. And I think a lot of people think that's one of the things that makes America so great and so beautiful, is that there are people from all around the world who call America home and have made America their home, and they introduce their culture and their food and their music. And we bring all those things together in a way that makes America very, very unique and vibrant as a culture and as a society. And we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And all men are created equal. And so, I think that probably most people would agree that these are all concepts or ideas that we would associate with America, with being American, and would probably also think are fairly great things about America. And as wonderful as all of this is, without any doubt, I think it's also very important to remember that before the Civil War, and before in particular the Reconstruction Era, there isn't a single one of these principles that apply to African Americans. Ms. Campbell, did you have a comment that you wanted to add?
We're hearing from some of our listeners that one of the things that they really relate to your concept of America as a diverse nation with people from different places, backgrounds. And one of the folks opines that one of the good things about American democracy is that it still is relatively new in the context of, world history, and that we can change. And so do you have some thoughts about that?
Well, I think that is what our founding fathers put into play with our Constitution. And I'm going to touch on that in a second with constitutional amendments, is because it empowers every generation with the tools to change our nation to best meet our current needs. So it's not a fixed document. The Constitution is malleable, and it's changeable, and it is able to evolve and keep up with the times. And I think that is part of the brilliance of our foundational document as a nation. So absolutely, it is 100% capable of change. And, we have the power to make our country into whatever it is that we want it to be.
Great. Well, keep going, keep telling your story, because
yes, absolutely. It's a wonderful question, and it actually just feeds in perfectly to the next slide. Because as I was saying, all of those different concepts that I talked about, different principles that I talked about, none of them applied to African Americans. I gave the example of the Mother Emanuel Church after the Denmark-Vesey slave revolt, where Black people were prohibited from practicing their religion, right? Black people certainly didn't have freedom of speech or the right to protest the government or the consent of the governed, all of those different due process of law, none of those things, until the Reconstruction Era. And what the Reconstruction Era did was, through three just transformational constitutional amendments, it changed the Constitution, and it made sure that all those wonderful things, all those things that make America so great and so unique, would have broad applicability. And so the first of the Reconstruction Amendments is the 13th Amendment. And what it did is it abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except for those duly convicted of a crime. And so the exception, I think is important to point out, because as we've seen, through different, if anyone has read The New Jim Crow or has seen the documentary 13th, and there's, various other mediums that have included the social commentary on the exception in the 13th Amendment, has contributed to mass incarceration and the overrepresentation of African Americans in the criminal justice system. But nonetheless, the 13th Amendment was still incredibly important in formally abolishing slavery and setting that floor where you're no longer supposed to have a U.S. economy or a Southern economy that was largely based on plantation slavery. And so incredibly monumental constitutional amendment. So we're changing the Constitution. This is an example of changing the Constitution. Yes, ma'am.
Just we might note at this point that tomorrow we have a scholar of the 13th Amendment who's going to be doing our webinar. So if anyone is interested in more scholarly details on the 13th Amendment, tune in tomorrow.
Perfect.
Keep going.
Another constitutional amendment that came in the Reconstruction era is the 14th Amendment. And so what the 14th Amendment did is it granted U.S. citizenship as a right to people born or nationalized in the United States. And it also promised due process and equal protection under the law for all. And so the 14th Amendment is singularly responsible for why America is as diverse of a country as it is, because there are many places around the world where you could be born in the country or you could move to the country and you would never obtain the rights of citizenship. But in America, you come here, you're either born here or you go through the naturalization process, and you are as American as someone who stepped off the Mayflower. And so it's a really just important and, in a way, revolutionary idea of establishing what makes someone a citizen of a country. And again, this promise of due process and equal protection under the law for all is so important, especially to African Americans who, 4.4 million African Americans were emancipated from slavery at the end of the Civil War. And, the vast majority of those African Americans lived in the Southern states that were a part of the Confederacy. And for those 4.4 million people to, finally have access to the courts, to be able to protect their rights to their personal safety, their any land rights that they wanted to protect, just all of those different things that you get through a legal system. And when you are not able to access that legal system, you're just subject to being taken advantage of nonstop. or worse. And the third of the Reconstruction amendments is the 15th Amendment. And what it did is it prohibits states from denying or bridging citizens' right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, what it does not do, I think, unfortunately, is it does not grant every citizen the right to vote. If you notice, the 15th Amendment it's written in the negative. It says states may not deny people the right to vote based on these three reasons. And what that means in a good way is that a state can't say, hey, you can't vote because you're Black. But this amendment was also exploited in the Jim Crow era, because what states did say is you, African American, well, it doesn't have to be specific to African American, but it was largely applied to African Americans. You have to pass a literacy test to determine if you should be able to vote. So we're not saying you can't vote because you're Black. We're saying you can't vote because maybe you can't read. And if you've ever seen any of those literacy tests, you could have a PhD from I don't know where, and it would be hard to pass them. They weren't just a basic reading test. Or it can let a state say, you can't vote unless your grandfather could vote, which is a grandfather clause, which was used in the Jim Crow era to prevent Black people from exercising their right to vote. Or another common method of disenfranchisement was the poll tax. And it would say you can only vote if you can afford to pay this tax, which, because of Black people's largely being in a worse financial position due to the years and years, centuries of slavery, enslavement, many were not able to afford the poll tax and were not able to vote. But these were three really important constitutional amendments that for the first time started altering the relationship between African Americans and the United States, and did a great deal towards taking those foundational American principles and giving them broad applicability. And I'll also note with the 15th Amendment, it says race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It doesn't mention sex or gender. So even though African American men were for a period given access to the vote, that didn't apply to African American women or white women or any other women. So just wanted to point that out. So I'd like to ask the audience to think about stepping into the shoes of a person who had been enslaved their entire life, whose parents had been enslaved, whose grandparents, everyone in their family tree that they know was born into slavery. And I would like to ask you to imagine that first day of freedom. What would be on your mind for your top priorities, the things that you want to do with your life, the things that are most exciting to you about being free? And so I'm going to share with you some of the things that come to mind. And again, Ms. Campbell, if you see responses or even if you want to chime in, just let me know. But until then, I'm just going to share some of the things that I think would be my top priority on my first day of being free from enslavement. And one is an education. It's important to remember that while African Americans were enslaved, they were prohibited from learning how to read or write. If an enslaved person was found trying to read a book, they could be maimed, they could be killed, various horrible things would await them. And so for so many African Americans, one of their highest priority with obtaining freedom was getting an education. And some of the ways that you'll see that manifest is with historically Black colleges and universities. If you take a look at the majority of the historically Black HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities that still exist in our country, the majority of them were founded in the Reconstruction era, all around the country, largely throughout the South. And so, I think that really tells you how important an education was, getting one to the newly freed people. Another thing that you'll see is that before the Reconstruction era, no Southern state had a system for public schools. The way that people, primarily white people, were educated in the South were through private tutors, and there wasn't a statewide public school system. But what you find is that the African Americans that were that were getting elected to their various state constitutional conventions, they really wanted to see the creation of a public school, a publicly funded school system, so that everyone would have access to an education. And so one of the progenitors of that idea is Robert Smalls in South Carolina, who's an absolutely fascinating individual, and later ended up serving as one of the first Black members of Congress, and actually one of the longest serving Black members of Congress in the Reconstruction era. He got a public school system added to the South Carolina state constitution at the 1868 convention, and it was the first Southern state to do so, and then other states ended up following. Another thing that I think would be a really high priority is reestablishing ties of community. So many families were separated through slavery and sold apart, and so the Reconstruction era was a prime opportunity to find lost children, to find parents, siblings, people that had been sold to various parts of the country or different parts of your state. And the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established at the beginning of the Reconstruction era, that's one of its main jobs, was family reunification. And so this is an example of a letter that appeared in a newspaper where someone says, "Do you know them? I have somewhere in Virginia, 2 brothers and 1 sister. My brother and I were sold from Lancaster County about 45 years ago at the sale of old Mrs. Polly Cavern. My father belonged to Joseph Cavern, and after his death, his wife sold us out. This is who my family is. Anyone who knows anything about any of the above parties will confer a great favor by writing me." And so, really, it's heartbreaking. There are websites out there that publish these letters and gather them from newspapers around the country, so you can really see what people were going through. And also in the same vein as communities are churches. And so a large number of African-American churches, Baptists, Methodists, all different denominations can also trace their origins to this period after the Civil War, the Reconstruction era. Another high priority is both physical and financial security. There were white supremacist domestic terrorist groups that were created in this Reconstruction era, the Ku Klux Klan being one of them, but not the only one. There were a number of different domestic terrorist groups around the country that were raising havoc and murdering Black people, committing massacres in Black towns. And often it was linked to trying to suppress Black people's political participation in running for office and voting. So that's physical security, wanting to obtain that physical security, and also financial security, because Black people, having been enslaved for so many centuries, they never had any savings, they never had any earnings, they did not own land, they didn't own a house, all the various things you would need to live as a free person. They did not have that, and so they were really starting from scratch. And so another institution that was created in this time that was a part of the Freedmen's Bureau was something called Freedmen's Bank. And it's something that I talk about in Black Was the Ink, that, it was this bank that had several million in deposits from Black depositors across the country. And quite tragically, it folded, and many African Americans, hundreds of thousands of African Americans lost their life savings. And another priority, again, is getting that consent of the government, this consent of the governed, and the ability to vote. And so you saw Black people participating in very high numbers and running for office and voting and getting elected to their state governments and to the United States Capitol. There were 16 African Americans who joined Congress between 1870 and 1877. And so that is what I'd like to turn to next. And just to tell you just a little bit more about Black Was the Ink and how this all ties in. When Malcolm, he ends up taking a journey to the Reconstruction era to walk in the shoes of his ancestor, Cedric, What Cedric did is he served as a legislative aide to the first Black members of Congress, to several of the first Black members of Congress. And that is the 16 that I just mentioned. 2 of those, and this is not all of them pictured, but this is a nice picture that shows quite a few of them in the early years of the 1870s together. Of the 16, half of them had been born in slavery and, had been considered someone's property not 10 years prior to serving in Congress. 2 of the 16 served as United States senators. Both of the senators represented the state of Mississippi. And then the congressmen were spread out throughout the country. And so what I really wanted Malcolm and the readers to get to experience is to learn about these fascinating people and to try to get an understanding of what their priorities were like in the earliest days of freedom for African Americans. But in addition, it's also really, I think, extremely important to recognize that these Black congressmen and all the things that they were trying to achieve and accomplish, they could not do it alone, and they did not do it alone. And so the book also highlights some great white American patriots that I think were fully invested and believed in the universality of all of those beautiful American principles and concepts that we talked about in the beginning. And so one of those is U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, who was a senator from Massachusetts. And he authored the Civil Rights Act ended up being passed in 1875, shortly after his death. But he authored the Civil Rights Act. And what it was a bill that prohibited racial discrimination in places open to the public, right? And so this bill is very similar to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was passed in the modern civil rights movement, and which civil rights lawyers still use today, every day, to protect people from being discriminated against. And so the fact that such a similar bill had not only been introduced in the 1870s, but actually passed and became law, I think is so fascinating. Some people may wonder, well, if this law existed in the 1870s, then how was the Jim Crow era, how could that have ever existed? Because it would have obviously been a total violation of this law. And the answer is that the Supreme Court actually struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875 in a series of cases called the Civil Rights cases that were decided in 1883. But still, just monumental and so encouraging, I think, to see that, to see how Americans can work together across different, races and backgrounds and everything to really try to make our democracy stronger and better and more inclusive. And another person that I highlight in the book is Attorney General Amos Ackerman. And he was the first Attorney General to lead the United States Department of Justice. The Department of Justice was another institution that was founded in the Reconstruction Era. And I worked there for 12 years. As some of the proudest career moments in my life was being able to represent the United States and protecting the civil rights of all Americans. And so the Department of Justice, prior to the Reconstruction Era, there had always been an attorney general, but it was usually someone who was in private practice. It was just a very small operation, and they would just represent the United States when the need arose, which wasn't that frequent. But because of the 3 Reconstruction amendments that I talked about, it gave a much larger role to the federal government in enforcing the civil rights and protections of all American citizens. And because of that larger role, the Department of Justice as an institution was created to help enforce those rights. And so Attorney General Ackerman was the first to actually lead the department. And in his leadership, he strongly enforced several bills that were passed in Congress called the Ku Klux Klan Acts. And what those bills did is it gave the federal government the ability to prosecute people under federal law for violating people's civil rights in terms of trying to prevent people from voting or intimidating people that were trying to vote, and all sorts of things that the organizations like the Ku Klux Klan were doing to African Americans. And so he led a crackdown on the Ku Klux Klan, in particular in South Carolina, where so many Klan members were arrested that it really dismantled the Klan in the state of South Carolina for a period. And it took a while for those organizations to rebuild much later. But all of these people, the tagline for Black Was the Ink is "Forgotten heroes still leave their mark." And all of these people left a tremendous mark on our country and our nation and our laws. And I don't think enough people know their name. And so I hope after reading my book, they get remembered a little better. And so just to point out, the scale of domestic terrorism that was taking place, so people can understand why the progress that had started in the Reconstruction era did not last. This is a image from Equal Justice Initiative, which is a civil rights organization, and it's a map of just massacres of African Americans that were taking place in just the Reconstruction era. And so this is the 1860s and 1870s. And you can see the number of people in the red who were killed during these massacres or lynchings. And because of this large scale violence and coordinated violence, it ended up intimidating Black people to the point where they did not vote. And subsequently, the laws in all of the southern former Confederate states were changed to really disenfranchise African Americans, and in a way that was able to usher in the Jim Crow period, which lasted for 100 years. And so as I present this, I want to emphasize that the concepts that I'm expressing and the way that I'm tying things together, I think have been expressed by so many others before. And really, it's just a desire to see America achieve its ultimate potential in being fully the nation that's always proclaimed itself to be. And so one example is, this is a poem by Langston Hughes, where he says, let America be America, the land that has never been and yet must be, the land where every man is free. And Frederick Douglass, echoed a similar sentiment in his poem. It wasn't a poem, it was a speech. But what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than any other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. And so you see different people in history that are saying, we love America and we want to fully participate in all of its, in all of its benefits and glory. And Martin Luther King, I think, expressed similar ideas and concepts in various speeches, including at the March on Washington. So if you guys have been interested in this presentation and what I've been presenting, I just wanted to share with you some other books for additional reading. And some of these were my sources for writing Black Was the Ink, and others are just books that I would recommend you check out. One of my favorite sources for the book is actually the Library of Congress. And so if you see the picture in the middle with those old-timey books, the Congressional Record, they are actually digitalized and available online. And so you don't have to take a trip to DC and go sit in a small dark room or anything and pour through congressional records. You could just Google Congressional Records, Library of Congress, and it will pull up speeches and debates, and you can go through by year. And so I was able to read the speeches from the congressmen as they were trying to pass these different civil rights laws to protect their rights and to protect all Americans' rights. And then there are various other books on Reconstruction. The book Capital Men is specifically about the first Black members of Congress, and it was so helpful and fascinating. And then for any younger classrooms that have joined the call, at the bottom, I put some books for our younger readers that they may find interesting. The book, The First Step, with the little girl on the cover, is about a little girl who wanted to, in Boston, who wanted to go to her neighborhood elementary school that was all white, but this was in the 1850s. And Charles Sumner, the same person that I mentioned a few minutes ago, is the senator from Massachusetts. He was an attorney in private practice in Boston at the time, and he took her case and fought for the desegregation of public schools in Boston. And they actually lost the case on the legal side, but they gained the sympathies of the Boston community, and the city ended up passing an ordinance to desegregate their own schools. So that's another example, going to the question that the person asked of, are we able to make these changes? And the answer is yes. Like, as citizens, as voters, we have the power every day to change our nation into the one we want to see and that we believe it should be. And so the citizens in Boston did that. And this young Black girl in the 1850s was able to go to her local neighborhood school. The book 7 Miles to Freedom is about one of the many amazing tales you could learn about Robert Smalls, who I also mentioned earlier, and I think is one of the most fascinating people that ever lived. So if you don't do anything else after this presentation, just Google Robert Smalls and learn a little bit more about him. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight, and I'm happy to answer any questions with the remaining time. And my website is michellecoles.com. That's my Instagram page and Twitter, if you care to follow me and keep up with what I'm doing.
Michelle, this has been really a wonderful presentation, and I had the privilege to read the book, and I would encourage everybody, because what you did with the book was you told the stories through the eyes of a teenager. And I think that it's an imaginative way to teach history. Now, why did you decide that it should be a teenager from Washington, D.C. who got sent down to Mississippi? Was that just thinking about your own boys?
A couple of reasons. One, I've been an adoptee of the DMV area. I'm originally from Louisiana, but I went to law school at Howard, and I've pretty much stayed here ever since. And so, one, I'm here, but I think more importantly, I really wanted him to be able to see this city, Washington, D.C., through a dual lens of the past and the present. And so I wanted him to have his experiences in the modern day, in the present, and then take that with him as he's walking through the streets of DC in the 1870s and seeing things that are familiar. Seeing, for instance, Georgia Avenue was there already in the 1870s. It didn't have the same, it had maybe some of the same buildings that it has today, but but certainly different buildings. There was a streetcar system, and so there wasn't a metro, but there was a streetcar that you could take at similar routes that people would take today. The Washington Monument at the time of the Reconstruction Era was halfway constructed. It was only, and if you look at the Washington Monument today, you can see where there's a color change halfway up. And so that's where the construction had started before the Civil War. And then the federal government didn't have enough money to continue building it during the Civil War. And so it had to wait until after the Civil War to finish. And so I just thought those would be a lot of really interesting visuals for him to have as someone who's familiar with the place, but then seeing it through a completely different lens.
Well, Michelle, we are so honored to have you with us, and that we are consistently, our messages are all about what a beautiful presentation, what a great way to tell a story. And I think that there will be lots of good follow-up from this conversation. And we really appreciate you doing this, especially with a 1-week-old baby. And I hope that little boy got to sleep, and it's great that his daddy's there to help you out. We really appreciate you being with us, and now you are part of the United States Capitol historical family as we
Such an honor.
Follow up, and we look forward to sharing the story. If anyone doesn't have, this is the book, and it is 100. I am not a teenage boy, and I loved it.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.
So it really is well worth a read and lots of fun. And so I'm thinking about who I'm going to give it to as a gift. So that is great opportunity.
Thank you.
We want to remind you that our next Capital Kids, which is our program where we bring authors that work particularly on programs for young people, is Dr. Kamisha Whitaker, who has written a book on Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune and the unusual friendship between the two of them. That's coming up on Wednesday, March 22nd at noon. And as we said during the presentation, tomorrow, you can still register to come and talk about the 13th Amendment. We've called it the original sin, slavery, abolition, and America's moral awakening. We have a wonderful young scholar who's going to join us to lead that conversation. And as we all watched the drama about the speaker's election in 2023, we thought it would be useful to take a look back 100 years to the speaker election in 1923, which also had many ballots. And so you can join us on March 2nd and learn about that speaker's election. As always, our programs are free. They're video tape recorded for our website, available later, and available only because of the contributions of members and supporters of the United States Capitol Historical Society. So thank you for your contributions, and thank you, Michelle Coles, for contributing your time and your talent to our effort. We're grateful to have you all. And for those of you who are teachers, thank you for investing in our next generation. Have a great day. See you tomorrow. Bye.